networks don't have 2 and 3 switches. They've got a lot more switches than that. And we're going to use our new best friend, the Cisco 3-layer networking model, to decide where the root bridge should be placed, and we will continue to come back to that model throughout the course. But before we move on, you know from watching the previous video, actually, and from your CCNA studies about how switches build a MAC address table, and how that when a switch is first added to a network, it has no entries, and the switch dynamically builds a MAC table by examining the source MAC address of incoming frames. And we talked about how unknown unicast frames are handled, broadcast frames are handled, and how known unicast frames are handled. And that's all nice and neat, you know, but for the most part, as we all know, production networks aren't always that nice and neat. And we never really want just one path between point A and point B, especially in today's networks. I mean, redundancy is more of a buzzword now than anything else, but you really do want that redundancy in a network today. We want a second path or a third path to be available when the first one to point B goes down. We've got to have that. But at the same time, we also want to avoid switching loops, because switching loops can quickly overwhelm a switch. And having multiple open paths to the same destination, that's what leads to switching loops in the first place. And that's why we have STP to begin with. Now, STP helps to prevent switching loops by putting ports along valid paths in blocking mode while leaving ports along the best path in forwarding mode. And when things work right and that best path becomes unavailable, then that next best path will start to become available, and will start to, because as you know, by default, it's going to take 50 to 55 seconds for it to be available. The official Cisco word is 50 seconds, but it's actually a little closer to 55. But let's take a look at an example of what would happen in a switching network with redundant paths if STP did not exist, because you can turn it off. And every once in a while, somebody wants to get fancy. Oh, you know, we'll turn spanning tree off. You better have a really good reason to do that. I wouldn't do it. But here's one example, and now this is redundancy. We have a lot of redundancy here. We have 3 separate switches connecting 2 Ethernet segments. So even if 2 of the switches go down, these hosts would still be able to communicate. But we better have STP on to prevent switching loops. And if we didn't, let's kind of walk through what would happen here. Let's say that A sends a frame to C. Now these are Ethernet segments, so all the devices on host A's segment are going to see it, and that includes all 3 switches. So if we didn't have STP, all 3 switches would get a copy of that frame on port 01, and none of those switches would have an entry for host A in their MAC table, right?